Now, today's lecture is on universal jurisdiction. Now, you've been reading the book, I hope, and you hear about territory, you hear about jurisdiction, you hear about all these things in international law, but there's this tension again, and that's the jurisdiction of states, like we've talked about before, and universal jurisdiction. And we talked about how this, is supposed to kick in with, say, genocide and intervention, and states have the just right to fight, basically go to war when it's only for defensive purposes. But what is universal jurisdiction? Universal jurisdiction is essentially the idea that if someone commits horrible crimes, and we're talking about people here, because this started out, and I think the book does talk about this with the Eichmann case. He was a Nazi. He was a horrible, horrible Nazi. And some of you might know the story. The Israeli Nazi hunters, I want to say Mossad, went to Argentina to get him, and they actually captured him. The rumor is, in addition to that, they actually saw Joseph Mengele, one of the most horrible Nazis, and let him go because they weren't after him, so they got Eichmann. And I mentioned this before, but this is one of the first cases for this universal jurisdiction. It doesn't matter where you are, because Argentina protested this, but to no avail, because the Holocaust is still, and that's good on people's mind, that this was a horrible, horrible event, obviously, the Holocaust. And remember, the Nazis killed not just Jews, but gypsies, people of, who was special ed and different types that didn't fit the Nazi characteristic and the stereotype, etc. But what's interesting about this was a real case. And the Eichmann case opened the door to the idea of universal jurisdiction. Of course, he was killed. I mean, I think he was one of the only people, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not an expert on the death penalty, that got the death penalty in Israel. So the idea was, when Argentina tried to take Israel to court, this is a matter of our matter, you interrupted our territory, that's the idea, is that, no, there's universal jurisdiction here, that this is a guy that was so horrible that he had to be tried in Israeli court. The other thing they keep on, the book kind of peppers with, is the Pinochet case. This is a very important case as well, and it mixes with the whole municipality law and local law that I talked about before, and the book talks about. The Pinochet case, and you'll be reading about the Letelier killings in Washington, D.C., is basically an important case for this idea of universal jurisdiction, because Pinochet was supposed to have immunity because he became senator for life. What happened was Pinochet overthrew, with the United States help, the CIA, etc., a man named Allende, who was quote unquote a socialist. And the idea was, he was a socialist, he needs to be overthrown, because Henry Kissinger was such a psycho in Latin America. I mean, anyone who criticized US or, said something socialistic was, considered deemed a communist and had to be overthrown. Ironically, Allende was actually in his last year or so of his time, because he was democratically elected. Why not just let this guy go out, and then they can have another election? But Henry Kissinger was so psychotic in the Nixon administration, later in the Reagan administration, that he wanted to invade just about every country. So this guy, for me, is a mass murderer, and for many other people, but he loved, going into Chile and overthrowing Allende and installing Pinochet. And Pinochet murdered, tortured, and killed many people. This is where you get, that open space, the whole idea of space again, for trying someone. So when he was caught in the UK, I want to say 1998, the idea was, do we not have the right, not me, but the UK, to try him under, because he, the point was he tortured Spanish citizens. And this was, obviously in the world, and this is sad, we elevate certain citizens to higher levels. So it wasn't the Chileans, it was like these Spanish people. And the House of Lords ruled that there was universal jurisdiction, even though the UK at the time, and that's where we get into treaties, wasn't necessarily in the torture treaty, but it was still universal jurisdiction. When he was actually sent back to Chile, he was tried for the murder and torture of Spanish citizens, and then they got into tax evasion, all this other stuff, just like Al Capone, I guess. But this opened the door to the idea of, there's obviously tension. This is my territory. You can't come into Argentina and take Eichmann, right? This is my territory. You can't do that. But there's this idea of universal jurisdiction. So a lot of scholars at that time were celebrating these cases like Eichmann, Pinochet. Later, there's other cases, like, for example, El Salvador. We supported the United States of America, brutal death squads in El Salvador, and some were tried. People have been extradited, etc. So these are all important cases. But then you get into this extraordinary rendition where states were going into other states like United States and Italy and kidnapping people because they were suspected terrorists, and trying to use, this idea of universal jurisdiction when they might be taking liberties with these cases and people were found innocent, etc. So that's what you start getting into, is that it's very interesting, international law, and I think all law is, because you essentially have these issues where it's like, okay, get Eichmann, he was a terrible Nazi, that's good. Get Pinochet, he tortured people, that's good. But then the other problem, and this gets into the precedent of international law, can people use this idea of universal jurisdiction to start just attacking other countries, right? Like, for example, could, one country say, oh, a soldier in the United States tortured people while they were in Vietnam, and then the Vietnamese, although of course they wouldn't be able to because Vietnam's not a world power, but just as a hypothetical example, then the Vietnamese come to the United States and kidnap the soldier and take him out. So this is the tension as well. So there's two tensions here. One, you have this, human rights, universal jurisdiction, Pinochet, Eichmann are very salient cases. And then you have a few others. And as the book notes and other literature notes, there's been other cases that continue with this that seem to be, very strong, very pro-human rights. But then you start getting into a slippery slope, to borrow from a legal term, obviously, the slippery slope. Do states begin to use this idea of your universal jurisdiction to start kidnapping people? Hey, if you're in Armenia, the Turks committed genocide against us, we need to go in and get that. And this is where you start getting into things like the killing of the Iranian general. Was that legal or not? And this is very, very interesting. And this can happen with Myanmar, right? Oh, the junta has committed genocide. Does the international community have the right to go into Myanmar and take those people? So it does produce a slippery slope. And it is very, very interesting. And I think that this is where we really have to start looking at international law, why international law, the behavior states are so important. So I want people to kind of understand that you're going to see cases out there that are pretty clear and cut. And remember, not everyone was supportive of these, back then, like Eichmann case, a lot of Latin American countries had Nazis. Hugo Banzer had a brutal French Nazi in his regime. He was Bolivian dictator, and basically Klaus Barbie was the Nazi's name. And Bolivia didn't want the Nazi hunters going in there and getting them. Brazil didn't want it. A lot of countries protested Israelis' incursions into South America. And remember, a lot of people, powerful people in the United States and Great Britain, protested the idea of sending Pinochet even back to Chile to be tried, because basically they were saying, no, he was our friend. I guess if you're a friend, you can torture and kill. The first George Bush protested, Margaret Thatcher protested, a lot of conservatives protested, saying he saved Chile from communism. I would not particularly agree with that. And the other point is that in the United States, he did commit, people forget, act of state terrorism. When you read that, that's not like some Huffington or Lefty Post. That's the CIA. That's archival data, and that's good, solid evidence. The CIA was supporting him. That's good, solid evidence of possible, that possible legality that this is a guy that supported terrorism in the United States Capitol. That's horrible. And we supported him. So we supported a man who committed an act of terrorism in our own capital, where he blew up a car. I mean, we're talking about the Capitol riots and all this stuff. How this stuff kind of misses history is absolutely amazing. And I think that this is very important to rethink history. And this is important for law. And this is important for all legality, history, research, et cetera, that this is a man that committed an act of state terrorism in our capital. And still politicians supported him, which I find pretty egregious. My personal opinion, you can debate me, I'm 100% wrong. Well, 90% wrong anyway, so you can debate me on that, et cetera. But he wasn't tried for that. How did a man who committed an act of terror in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, get support by very conservative people who would be like, anti-terrorist, pro, police and all this stuff? Unbelievable. And, he was never tried, like this person behind me, who, as I mentioned before, was some kind of headhunter. And I'm going to get some water here, but vodka. I'm taping this in the morning, so it's okay to drink vodka. So this headhunter here was probably tried, and that's what happened to him. So watch out for that. And the other thing about reviewing history, you're also going to read, I know that there's a lot of work you people have to do in other classes. You work full time. I have a great respect for all of you in the online venue. But you will read my article on the Central American Court of Justice. And I want you to take away from that the same thing I'm talking about the Letelier case, where Pinochet committed an act of terrorism. Should we take him to an international court, even in absentia, because he's dead? But the Central American Court of Justice, no one talks about, right? Because it was by developing countries, very poor countries. So do these countries, right, add to international law? And that's what I want you to take from the article that was written by a brilliant person, me, of course, and what that's about. So what's it about is it actually addressed real issues in international law. It was the first court in the world where states suspended their sovereignty and actually did something for international law. And I really want you to read that because I wrote it. And as you know, no one will read our stuff as academics unless we force you students to do it, whether you like it or hate it. So I really want you to read that to understand each case and the big case and why it was disbanded. The United States, through the Carnegie, actually helped create it. But then they just got rid of it because it ruled against U.S. interests, which is absolutely amazing. So when you rule against U.S. interests or any powerful country's interests, it's not just the United States, it would be Russia, Cuba, Iran, etc. We don't want anyone ruling against our interests. And this shows you what the issue of the whole territory, jurisdiction, etc. And this is about power. So if you have the power to help disband the court, and this was the first court and that states would suspend their sovereignty to, it worked well. It actually has important cases for international law and can contribute to international law. But unfortunately, it was disbanded. So read that. That'll pop up on a quiz because I wrote it. And I'm very egotistical. My parents didn't give me much love. So now I look for the love of students. So anyways, I'm going to end there. And I hope everyone's staying safe from the COVID, etc. I think I'm sick. Do I have COVID? Wow, I'm like over 70, so that would be a death sentence for me. So take care, everyone. Read that article, read the thing, but look at the idea of universal jurisdiction, which this video is about, and then the idea that, although the Central American Court worked well, think about it, it was still disbanded for stepping on U.S. interests. So take care, everyone, and stay safe out there.